This video will guide you through attaching your quilt layers to your JUKI machine quilting frame. It will also demonstrate rolling the fabric and what to do when you've completed the quilt. We recommend that you start with some practice material so you can become familiar with quilting on a frame before doing your first quilt. There is more than one order in which to install your fabric layers. Any order will work as long as the correct layer is placed on the correct rail with the correct side facing up. Installing your fabric to your frame is much easier thanks to the FabriFast system. Each rail has a FabriFast slot and tubing, and you can use the included FabriFast tool to attach your cloth leaders or fabric to your frame. Before we begin, here are some helpful tips for preparing the quilt layers for machine frame quilting. Cut off the selvages of your fabrics. These can make the quilt layers tighter when left on. Use a longer stitch length when piecing your quilt layers so your seams will lay flat. Open your seams and iron them flat before putting your quilt on the frame. This will make them easier to quilt over. There are 3 fabric layers to a quilt: the bottom or backing layer, the batting layer, and the top layer. When planning out the layers for machine quilting, always make the backing layer 4 to 6 inches larger than the top layer all the way around. Let's take a look at the rails of the frame. This bottom rail is the batting rail. Your batting will roll onto this rail in this direction. This rail is the quilt top rail. The top layer of your quilt rolls onto it in this direction. This is the backing rail. The bottom layer of your quilt rolls onto it in this direction. This is the idler rail. No fabric is directly attached to it. And this top rail is the take-up rail. All 3 layers of your quilt come together and are rolled onto this rail in this direction. Cloth leaders are a good way to manage and align your fabric, and they allow you to quilt the very top and end of your quilt on your frame. We'll be using Grace Company brand cloth leaders for this segment, but you can also make your own. Start by making a center mark on each cloth leader on the edge that you'll be pinning to your fabric. The shortest cloth leader goes on the take-up rail, the middle length cloth leader goes on the backing rail, and the longest cloth leader goes on the quilt top rail. There is no need for cloth leader on the batting rail. To attach the cloth leaders to the rails, line up the FabriFast line on the cloth leaders with the FabriFast slot in the rails. Install the cloth leaders into each rail by pushing the fabric into the FabriFast slot with the tubing, using the FabriFast tool. There may be extra FabriFast tubing at the end of the rails. You can trim this with scissors if you would like. When you're finished, the printed side of all the cloth leaders should face up when they are pulled towards the center of the frame as shown. Make sure that all your cloth leaders are centered on the rails. For maximum precision, you can measure the distances between the rail ends and the cloth leaders to make sure they are all the same. Now we'll pin the fabric layers to the cloth leaders. We'll start with the backing layer. First, mark the center of the fabric so that you can match it up to the center of the cloth leader. We'll use a pin to mark the center. Pin the backing layer to the cloth leader on the take-up rail. Start by lining up the center marks on the top layer and cloth leader, and then pin the fabric together starting from the center and working your way toward the edges. Notice that the finished side of the fabric layer is facing down as we pin it. After pinning the backing layer to the take-up rail cloth leader, pin the other end of the fabric to the cloth leader on the backing rail. Again, start by pinning in the center and working your way toward the edges. When you have finished pinning the fabric, roll it onto the backing rail. Make sure that it rolls onto the rail straight and evenly. Use your hands to smooth out any wrinkles as you roll, without stretching the fabric. We'll now put our batting onto the frame. First, mark the center of the batting's edge with a pin, then lay it flat and centered over the backing layer. Pin the batting layer to the backing layer, not the leader cloth. Pin from the center and work your way toward the edges. Now insert the other end of the batting between the backing and quilt top rails. Attach the batting to the batting rail using the FabriFast system. If your batting is fairly thick, it might be easier to attach it to the rail with tape rather than with the FabriFast tube. Lastly, roll the batting onto the batting rail. Make sure not to stretch the batting. Next, we'll attach the quilt top layer to the frame. Begin by marking the center of the edge with a pin. Now pin the top layer to the batting and backing, pinning from the center out. Make sure that the finished side of the fabric is facing up as you pin. Next, pin the other end of the top layer to the leader cloth on the quilt top rail. Line up the centers of the fabrics and pin from the center out. Now roll the quilt top onto the quilt top rail. Smooth out any wrinkles as you roll. Now we'll attach the bungee clamps to the side of your fabric. First, attach the clamps to the backing and batting layers, then pull the bungee cord through the provided holes and secure them with the bungee locks. Do this on both sides of the frame. If you wish, you may now use your sewing machine to baste the top and sides of your quilt with the long baste or stitch setting. This will help keep your fabrics aligned and save you time at the end of your project. You can remove the pins at the top of your quilt when you have finished basting it. After you have quilted a row or section, you will need to roll up the quilt. First, remove the bungee clamps. Then unlock the ratchets so that the rails can roll backwards, and roll the fabric onto the take-up rail. Lock the rails again and replace the bungee clamps. If you used your machine to baste the quilt in the beginning, you can continue to baste down the left and right sides of the quilt every time you roll to a new section. When you get to the end of your quilt, unpin the quilt top layer from the cloth leader and then repin the top layer just to the batting and backing. Now use a long baste or stitch setting on your machine to baste along the bottom sides of your quilt. Congratulations! You've attached your fabric to your frame and machine quilted for the first time on your JUKI quilting frame. After getting familiar with this process, we know you'll enjoy many projects on your quilting frame. If you ever have any questions, many resources can be found on our website at www.graceframe.com, or you can give us a call at 1-800-264-0644.